When a judge, notorious for his anti-Trump stance and mired in corruption, decides to publicly humiliate JD Vance in the middle of a courtroom, he believes himself above the law. But when his victim chooses to retaliate, karma strikes with lightning speed, leaving the courtroom suspended in an eerie silence. Before we dive into this story filled with twists and turns, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments from which part of the world you're seeing this. The day began like any other at the federal court, except for the judge's foul mood. William Duffy, infamous for his explosive temper, stormed into the courtroom, already barking orders. "I've made it clear, I don't want coffee in this courtroom," he snapped at his secretary, making the young woman flinch. "And tell the defense team if they're not here in 2 minutes, I'll charge everyone with contempt of court." The crowd filling the gallery watched as Duffy strode to the bench, his face contorted in irritation. His reputation for doling out harsh punishments was legendary, but recently his behavior had shifted from rude to outright erratic, especially in cases involving conservative figures. "Your Honor," the court employee spoke cautiously as the Vice President, Vance, arrived to give his testimony. The moment Duffy laid eyes on him, his expression darkened as though he had just been personally insulted. "Oh, so he finally deigns to show up," he sneered, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Tell him this isn't the Senate floor. Here, titles mean nothing." The atmosphere shifted the instant Vance entered the courtroom. He moved with calm seriousness, respectfully greeting the staff. Duffy glared at him like a predator stalking its prey, impatiently tapping his fingers on the bench. "Let's make something crystal clear," Duffy announced with a voice dripping in contempt. "I don't care what position you hold in Washington. In my court, I'm the one in charge. Got it, Mr. Vance?" Vance's composed response seemed to irk Duffy even further. "Understood, Your Honor. I'm here solely as a witness to the truth." Duffy curled his lip in skepticism. "We'll see about that," he muttered. His eyes scanned the defense table, his expression a mix of disdain and suspicion. "Time to start this circus," he cut in abruptly. The defense attorney's opening statement was immediately interrupted by the judge. "And just to be clear, I have zero patience for political grandstanding in my courtroom," Duffy snapped, glaring at Vance. "This is not a rally." The defense attorney tried to continue. "Your Honor, we're simply providing context on Mr. Harmon's philanthropic activities." Duffy rolled his eyes theatrically. "Context? What you mean is more of your conservative fairy tales about family values." An uncomfortable silence gripped the gallery, even the prosecution visibly uncomfortable with the judge's blatant bias. But Duffy barely noticed. "Let's be honest," he leaned forward, his face flushed with rage. "I'm sick of seeing rich conservatives hide money behind charitable facades. Your presence doesn't impress me, Vice President. It makes me doubt the character of the defendant even more." Vance remained calm, his serenity only fueling Duffy's hatred. The judge's hand trembled as he flipped through papers, his eyes bulging with what seemed like paranoia. "I have here," Vance continued, his voice steady but firm, "documentary evidence of Mr. Harmon's charitable contributions, including records of meetings in March. These documents are inadmissible," Duffy shouted, though no formal objection had been made. His reaction was personal, almost frantic. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stood, "on what grounds are you rejecting? Don't you dare question my decisions." Duffy's face was livid. "One more word and you'll join your client in a contempt charge." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This no longer felt like a matter of judicial discretion. It was becoming a blatant vendetta. "Your Honor," Vance insisted respectfully, "these documents were properly submitted during the discovery phase." Duffy sneered, his voice venomous. "I imagine your cozy connections in the White House had nothing to do with this, huh?" He leaned forward with contempt. "I know people like you, Vice President. You think you can waltz into my courtroom hiding behind political privilege?" "Objection, Your Honor," the defense attorney dared to protest. "These insinuations are completely inappropriate." "Enough," Duffy roared, banging his gavel so forcefully that the sound reverberated through the room, as if the walls themselves trembled. "I won't take moral lessons, especially not from a conservative puppet." Duffy sneered, pointing a trembling finger at Vance. "Don't try to turn this into a political rally." "Your Honor," Vance replied, unwavering, "perhaps we should review the specific content of the March 15th meeting." The change in Duffy's expression was instantaneous, as if someone had yanked on a live wire. His hate quickly morphed into something resembling fear. The judge froze, his gavel still suspended in the air, eyes locked on Vance as if confronting a ghost. These meetings aren't relevant," Duffy stammered, his voice faltering, losing its usual authority. "They are irrelevant, period." But it wasn't just his voice that wavered. His hands trembled as he flipped through documents, desperately trying to regain control. "Not relevant?" Vance whispered, his tone quiet but sharp. "Curious, Your Honor, because these meetings directly involve the charitable donations at the heart of this case." Bah! Duffy slammed both hands on the bench. "Enough about those meetings," he thundered. "I'll have you thrown out of here, now." The weight of his words hit the room like lead, silencing everything in its wake. The judge, his face twisted with frantic energy, rifled through the papers in a frantic search for anything that could save him. Then, suddenly he snapped. "In fact," he yelled, his voice shaking with fury, "I'm declaring you in contempt, Mr. Vance. You think your position protects you, but you're nothing more than a lackey for Trump, dressed in an expensive suit." Vance remained composed, his calm only heightening Duffy's fury. "My position has no relevance to this case, Your Honor. But since you mentioned protection, perhaps we should discuss the Liberty Foundation's protection payments." Duffy's face drained of color in an instant. "How dare you, payments? That's a lie," he roared. "Security, remove this man from my courtroom." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly shaken. Even they could feel that the judge had crossed a line. "Actually, Your Honor," Vance said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a set of papers, "I have here some very interesting bank records. Could you explain these monthly deposits from offshore accounts that coincide with your judicial decisions against conservative defendants?" "Shut up!" Duffy screamed, losing all semblance of control. "You have no rights here. I am the law, and I won't tolerate some conservative lapdog attacking me." Vance remained calm, holding up a document. "Your signature, Your Honor, on these authorization forms suggests otherwise." What happened next stunned even the courtroom veterans, accustomed as they were to Duffy's outbursts. The judge leaned forward over the bench, a trembling finger aimed at Vance, his face contorted in rage. "You fabricated all this," Duffy yelled. "This is a trap. A conservative conspiracy." Vance's response was measured and unflinching. "A conspiracy?" he repeated, his voice calm. "Interesting that you use that term, especially considering your private meetings with certain activist groups." "I will not be interrogated in my own courtroom," Duffy shrieked, his face reddening like a volcano on the verge of eruption. "You think you can come here with your righteous face and evidence?" He almost spat the word as though it were the greatest insult. "Evidence that reveals a disturbing pattern," Vance continued, unfazed. "For example, the Thompson case from last month? The small businessman who lost everything because you refused to allow evidence of his charitable work to be presented. Just like you're trying to do now." Duffy's laughter was jagged and manic. "Thompson? That fraud got what he deserved. They all think they can hide money behind faith and family values. Should we discuss the Wilson case?" Vance interjected, pulling out another document. "Where, mysteriously, you decided to seal all the case files just hours after meeting with representatives from the Liberty Foundation?" Duffy's expression twisted in disbelief. How does he know about that? He realized his slip-up too late and quickly tried to swallow his words. "What about, Your Honor?" Vance asked, his voice steady. "What about the meeting? Or the $500,000 that mysteriously appeared in your offshore account the following day?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Duffy slammed the gavel down with fury, but it did little to silence the growing chaos. "Order! I demand order!" Duffy shouted, his voice hoarse from the tension. "This is all fabricated. It's a conservative conspiracy, just like in the case of Mrs. Anderson." Vance continued, unfazed. "A grandmother who lost all her savings because you blocked her from explaining the source of the money she used to settle her debts." "Silence!" Duffy roared, his face twisted with rage. "You don't understand. I am the law here." Vance's gaze never wavered. "Your Honor, perhaps you've forgotten something, the same day you opened that offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Duffy stood up abruptly, his robe wrinkling as he pointed at Vance in a wild gesture. "Guards, arrest this man for contempt," he screamed. "Confiscate all his documents now." The officers remained frozen, unsure of what to do. Duffy's voice cracked as he continued his orders. "I gave an order. Arrest him. And if anyone refuses, they'll be thrown in jail too." The room plunged into a deathly silence, the tension so thick it seemed to smother every breath. No one moved. The officers stood paralyzed, caught between the obligation to follow a federal judge's orders and the undeniable injustice unfolding before their eyes. "Last chance," Duffy hissed through clenched teeth, his fury palpable. "Hand over those documents and submit to arrest, or I'll make sure you never set foot in a courtroom again." "Interesting threat, Your Honor," Vance replied, his voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed down on the room. "Much like the one you made to Mrs. Sarah Mitchell before you dismissed her discrimination case, right after you met with CEO James Peterson." Duffy's face drained of color, and for a moment, he looked like he had been struck. How do you know about that?" he stammered. Vance pressed on, his voice growing colder with each word. "The same James Peterson who deposited $500,000 into your Cayman Islands account, right? The same James Peterson who hosted a meeting on his private yacht last month with 7 other judges, just days before they ruled in favor of his company. You don't have the right to say this." Duffy shouted, his voice breaking as he spat each word. "These records are privileged. They were obtained illegally." "Illegally?" Vance's voice was sharp. "Like the recordings from inside your office? The ones where you instructed your secretary to cover up evidence that exonerated 3 conservative defendants." At that moment, the judge's secretary, who had remained silent and hidden in the back of the room, suddenly broke down in tears. He made me do it," she cried, unable to hold it in anymore. "He threatened me, said if I didn't he'd ruin my career." "Enough!" Duffy shouted, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. "None of this can be used as evidence. You can't prove it was me." "Actually, Your Honor," Vance interrupted, his calm unbroken, "everything was obtained legally. Security cameras recorded the destruction of documents at midnight. Your phone recorded the threats you made. And your signature is on the bank transfer documents." In a desperate, frantic motion, Duffy lunged forward once more, attempting to grab the papers from Vance's hands. "Give me those files. This is an order." "Order denied," a new, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. Everyone turned to see a group of FBI agents filing into the courtroom, moving with purpose. The lead agent stepped forward, flashing his badge. "We are here to inform you that this court is now under federal investigation," he declared. Judge William Duffy stood frozen, his face contorted in disbelief. "You can't do this," he screamed, taking a few steps backward, nearly stumbling over his own robe. "I have immunity. I have connections. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" The lead FBI agent looked at him coldly. "We know exactly who you are, Your Honor. Including your recent meetings with the Liberty Foundation, your accounts in tax havens, and your coordinated actions against conservative defendants." Duffy's eyes flickered with anger as he desperately searched for a way out, like an animal cornered. "This is a trap. A conspiracy by the conservatives." His voice cracked with panic. "A conspiracy?" Vance repeated calmly, his voice unwavering. "The only conspiracy here is the systematic abuse of the judiciary as a political weapon. Every biased ruling, every backroom deal, every attempt to silence the truth, it all ends today. You planned this." Duffy shouted, trembling as he pointed his finger at Vance. "You Trump worshippers set me up." "Not at all, Your Honor," Vance replied, shaking his head almost pityingly. "You dug your own grave. We simply followed the trail left behind by your greed, and your actions today confirmed everything." The FBI agents moved forward, positioning themselves around the judge's bench. Duffy, in a final act of desperation, lunged forward. "I'm a federal judge. You can't handcuff me. I am the law. You can't do this." But the officers had no choice but to restrain him by force when he tried to rush toward the side exit. By now, Duffy was screaming, completely losing control. "You don't understand. They forced me. The Foundation has dirt on everyone. If I speak now—" "Interesting," interrupted the lead agent. "Then perhaps you'd like to tell us more about this foundation, Your Honor?" It seemed that Duffy, now realizing how much he'd already revealed, went silent. His face twisted between panic and fury, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Yet, somehow he managed to regain his composure just enough to flash a bitter, tight-lipped smile. "I want my lawyer," he spat. "And when all of this is over, you'll pay dearly for humiliating me." "Speaking of payment," Vance said, moving closer and holding out another document. "Perhaps you'd like to explain these transfer records, Your Honor? 7 judges received similar deposits to yours on the same days, and each one ruled against conservative defendants in their cases." The gallery was filled with a growing murmur. It was clear that what was at stake was not just an isolated case, but an immense web of judicial corruption involving multiple individuals and cases. The evidence was irrefutable, and Vance, taking control of the situation, raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "What we are witnessing here," he declared, "is not an isolated mistake, but a systemic project, where the judicial system has been turned into a political weapon." He paused, his voice now firm with unwavering conviction. "But justice should not be a weapon. It must be a shield, protecting everyone equally without discrimination." Duffy, who had previously fought to maintain any dignity, stopped resisting. His face now reflected total defeat, the expression of someone who knew that all his schemes had been exposed. Behind him, officers were already sealing his office for a complete search, while his secretary, still in tears, was consoled by agents who were asking questions. Little by little, it became clear to everyone that Duffy's threats were not limited to one or two cases, but encompassed a vast network of manipulated and corrupted proceedings. When he was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed, Duffy made one last desperate attempt to challenge the inevitable. He turned, glaring at Vance with hatred. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his voice bitter. "There will always be people like me. You can't stop us." Vance looked at him with a serenity almost tinged with sadness, as if he pitied the fate of a man who had lost himself in his own power. "Indeed," he replied calmly, "people who abuse power will always exist. But there will also always be those willing to stand up against that abuse." He paused, and his words echoed with undeniable truth. "That is what keeps the justice system alive, not the corruption you represent, but the courage of those who fight to preserve it." The outcome was swift, but inevitable. Duffy's arrest triggered a series of investigations that spread like an avalanche across various regions. The network of corrupt judges he had helped sustain began to crumble in the face of the overwhelming evidence and the growing number of testimonies. It was a particularly symbolic moment when the case against Harmon was finally dismissed. The new judge, upon reviewing the evidence that Duffy had tried to hide at all costs, concluded that there was no basis for the charges. He recognized that, in the end, justice is not defined by those who try to control it, but by those who are willing to defend it, no matter the cost. And so, the truth prevailed, not through power or manipulation, but through the courage of all those who stood up to abuse and corruption. If you believe in the importance of defending the truth and demanding accountability, like this video and subscribe to The Hidden Raylet for more inspiring stories. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for following. See you in the next story.